my pleasure to invite to the podium for the first time in the meeting today another one of our guest lecturers, Dr. Wesley Moore, Professor and Chief Emeritus of Vascular Surgery at UCLA. As most of you are probably aware, Dr. Moore was involved on the ground floor of development of endovascular therapies for aortic aneurysms. He's going to talk to us about the evolution of endovascular treatment of aortic aneurysms. Wes.
Thanks very much, Bill. And first of all, I'd like to express my thanks and appreciation to Dave Dawson and his colleagues at UC Davis for the opportunity to participate in this excellent conference. I'd also like to congratulate him on his foresight in making this a multidisciplinary conference. No matter what our union cards say, we're all involved in the treatment of patients with vascular disease, and the disciplines have the opportunity to learn from one another. As surgeons recognize the importance of catheter-based intervention and have adopted those techniques in their practice, so have interventionists, as time has gone along, recognize some of the limitations associated with catheter-based intervention and begin to see instances where perhaps an open surgical approach would be required. Finally, as medical management has improved in the management of vascular disease, all of us are recognizing that the first stage of treatment need not necessarily be an operation or an intervention, but might very well be medical management alone. So the opportunity to bring all of these disciplines together to learn from each other, I think, is prescient. I have no verbal disclosures other than the fact that I've been involved in clinical trials and have received research support from several, nothing that involved personal remuneration. My introduction to catheter-based intervention, as it may become a part of my own practice, occurred with a telephone call in the summer of 1989 from Harrison Lazarus. For those of you who don't know Harrison, he's a general and vascular surgeon in Salt Lake City and an individual who has a very inventive mind, holds a number of patents in a variety of technical procedures. And what Harrison told me over the telephone was that he's got a new way to fix aneurysms and wanted to know if I would be willing to be a part of an advisory board that was going to be meeting at the time of the American College of Surgeons meeting that fall in Atlanta. Well, having nothing better to do at an ACS meeting, I said, sure, why not? What I didn't know at the time was that he actually had a patent published in 1988, and had I known that, I probably would have looked up the patent to get an idea what he was talking about, but I didn't know that until much later. Well, when I got to the meeting, after we all signed our non-disclosure agreements, he pulls out this thing that looks like sort of a shortened fly rod and says, I'm going to fix aneurysms with this. And I looked at him and I said, Harrison, you've really lost it. I mean, there's no way that that's ever going to work. And what he had was a device that had this graft that you can see here. And this is an unsupported polyester prosthesis with an attachment system at each end that's got little hooks that would then bite into the aorta to provide longitudinal stability. This is just the fairly simple delivery system. You basically, after you got it into position, you unsheathed it and the thing popped open, and there was a balloon intrinsic with the system that was used to nail in these barbs into the aortic wall, both proximally and distally. Limitation at that time was that it was a tube graft, so that there were very few patients who would be candidates for this early iteration of an endograft. The other thing that was kind of interesting was that this was not an over-the-wire system at the time. And what you had was this sort of little wire at the end of the device that made it self-seeking, so that you passed this under fluoroscopy and hoped that you weren't shoving it through the wall of the aorta as this thing meandered its way in. What we ultimately learned was that the sheath that was used for the delivery of the system was over the wire, and by using a very long sheath, you could put the sheath over the wire up to the neck of the aneurysm, then pass this thing through as a de facto over-the-wire system, even though the early iteration was not. I should point out that there has been a lot of prior experimental work that received rather little notice up until this particular point in time. And for example, Charles Dotter, who's the father of catheter-based intervention, or endovascular intervention, I should say, reported in Investigative Radiology in 1969 the placement of transluminally placed coil springs in end-arterial tube grafts in the canine popliteal artery, and he documented long-term patency. Well, that sort of got lost in the literature, but it's there, and he was thinking about it at the time. This paper by Craig and colleagues in 1983 described the non-surgical placement of an arterial endoprosthesis using a nitinol wire system. Again, reported in radiology, sort of read and forgotten. I should point out this really isn't an endovascular technique in the usual sense, but it does involve placing non-sutured prostheses in the vascular system. And this technique by Lamole was used to treat thoracic aortic dissection. And rather than by resecting the thoracic aorta and sewing in a graft, they simply opened the thoracic aorta. They had a graft with sort of a rigid ring at each end, put it in there, tied a string around externally, holding it in place. And so I think that this is sort of a hybrid approach, if you will, but does deserve to be recognized as one of the original endovascular techniques. Balco and colleagues reported in the Journal of Surgical Research in 1986 the transfemoral placement of an intraluminal polyurethane prosthesis for abdominal aortic aneurysm. And what they did was they had a group of patients that were scheduled for conventional open aneurysm repair, and they wanted to test the hypothesis that they could, by catheter-based techniques, put a graft into the abdominal aorta, deploy it, and then of course they weren't going to leave it there because they had no IDE from the FDA to do that, but they wanted to show that it was feasible. And again, this is 1986, and they received very little notice for this, but this is really one of the first attempts documenting that you could place an endograft into the aorta. They then took the endograft out and did a conventional repair. This particular publication was sort of discovered after the fact, and I'll get to the point in a moment where Perotti really has received all of the credit in terms of endografting, but somebody went back and did a survey of the non-English literature and discovered this particular publication in Russian by a surgeon named Volodos, who in fact repaired thoracic aortic aneurysms and reported it in 1986, but because it was in the Russian language in an obscure journal, nobody ever noticed it, and it was only after the fact that it was picked up in a literature search. But clearly, the report by Perotti, Palmas, and Baroni in the Annals of Vascular Surgery in 1991 really caught everyone's imagination because we were sort of psychologically ready to look at an endovascular solution to aneurysm repair. And what Perotti did, he didn't have a device that was specifically made for aneurysm repair. What he did was he took components and put them together with the idea that he could repair very specific aneurysms in high-risk patients. And what he did is he took a polyurethane, or a polyester graft, and initially sewed a Palmas stent to the proximal end of that. He then folded this up, put it inside a sheath over a guide wire that had a catheter inside the Palmaz stent, passed the whole system up over a guide wire, positioned it below the renal arteries, retracted the sheath, and then by inflating the balloon and expanding the Palmaz stent, got proximal attachment to the graft. And the original iteration was that the distal end of the graft was sort of free floating, and the hope was that it would, by pressure within inside the graft, engage the distal neck of the aneurysm. And again, these are patients that were suitable for tube graft repair, and that this would work. Well, he quickly found out that he needed a distal attachment system, so he sewed another Palmaz stent after measuring the length of what he would need, put that in the catheter delivery system and deployed it. But this particular report got worldwide attention and really triggered the onset of the race to develop newer and better techniques for treating abdominal aortic aneurysm using stent grafts. Now, Harrison Lazarus, getting back to his original device that he patented in '88, and then we started working on with him in '89, he was associated with a startup company in Menlo Park here in Northern California called Endovascular Technologies, or abbreviated EVT. And about that time, EVT got an FDA-approved IDE to begin a phase 1 trial. And because of the proximity of 3 institutions, specifically Stanford, UCSF, and UCLA, to the Menlo Park facility, those 3 institutions were chosen to be involved in the phase 1 feasibility trial. And all of us started to rapidly screen patients for potential cases, and I was lucky to be the first to come up with a case. The story of that is kind of interesting. We saw a number of patients that had appropriate aneurysms that we could repair with the tube graft device. And I remember one I saw, and I showed the device, and I told him how this is going to be great, a little cut down the femoral artery instead of this big slash from up and down his abdomen. And he said, great. He says, how many of these have you done? And I said, well, you're going to be the first. And he says, wrong. He says, I'm going to be the 10th. So we went through this a number of times, finally found one individual who was really sort of taken with the technology and volunteered to be the first. And in February 10th, 1993, we went ahead and implanted the first device that was specifically designed for treatment of abdominal aortic aneurysm. And here is the aortogram from that patient. And you can see he's got a nice long neck between the lower right renal artery, then the aneurysm. And he's actually got a fairly short distal neck, but it was long enough that I felt that we could probably get the distal attachment system seated into that. And this was kind of an exciting time. We had video cameras set up in the operating room. We had the people from EVT up in a viewing room upstairs, and everyone was holding their breath as this thing was being deployed. And when this was, again, is the device that we used, which was the tube graft, unsupported proximal and distal attachment systems. Here was the sheath going into the femoral artery. This sheath was divided. It had a gate valve here and then a sort of a shutter valve proximally. So with a double valve system, we were able to maintain hemostasis. The good news of that was that we could then get the device up even though it wasn't an over-the-wire system. The bad news was this was huge. This had an OD of about 25 French, and so there wasn't every patient that we were able to get this into. And here was the completion angiogram of that first patient. And even though these folks were about 3 floors away from us from the operating room, you could hear the cheers down in the operating room as suddenly all the investors in this startup company suddenly saw the possibility of getting a recovery on their investment. So we had the opportunity to present this at the Northwestern meeting later that year. And so actually the first publication on this was a book chapter in the Yao and Pierce book from 1993. We then went on to work with them in the development of a bifurcated graft because it was pretty obvious that only about 10% of the aneurysm population would be suitable for this particular iteration of a tube graft. And Bill Quinones at our division did a lot of the experimental work, interestingly enough, using the facility on the Davis campus with using large animals to implant these. And so in September 1994, the two of us implanted the first bifurcated graft. And that was a little bit this is obviously a later iteration once Guidant had bought out EVT, showing the over-the-wire system. And one of the advantages that we thought at the time was that it was one piece. It was unsupported so that it could take all the bends and curves pretty easily. There was no possibility of any component separation, and that there was a fairly minimal metal to fabric interaction. I haven't talked about some of the other devices that had been looked at. One of the devices that was developed in Belgium was subsequently bought by Boston Scientific, called Vanguard. They had some significant problems in that the stents that were sutured into the fabric ultimately developed holes, which led to type 3 endoleaks. So we thought one of the advantages here was that there was a fairly minimal amount of metal involved in the graft, and for all intents and purposes, this looked like a standard bifurcation graft that one might sew in place. They ultimately developed, not only did they have the tube graft that we started with and the bifurcated graft, but they also recognized that there might be instances where you would like to use an aorto uniiliac. So they had an occluder that would go up the opposite side, and then you'd complete that with a fem-fem crossover graft. And all 3 of these went through phase 2 and subsequently 3 trials and were incorporated. Now, the next thing that happened was the idea that maybe the best thing to do would be to sort of build the graft inside the patient by using a modular concept. And here's the first modular graft, not really the first, but the first that received FDA approval, which was the Anurex graft. This graft was actually developed by Tom Fogarty and his engineering group in Palo Alto, and then subsequently sold to Medtronic, who then went ahead and commercialized it. I'm not going to mention all of the other grafts that have then gone on utilizing the modular technique, but obviously, with the exception of Endologics, modular has pretty much dominated the field ever since. Gore quickly after Anurex came online developed their own system, and this is one of the more popular modular devices that is currently being used today. Up until this point, there were certain very definite limitations associated with stent grafting. You had to be able to get there, so the vessels the access vessels had to be large enough to accommodate the delivery systems. You had to have a decent enough neck between the renal arteries to be able to seat it by whatever seating mechanism you wanted to use. And as the technology has developed, neck lengths have shortened. And so we've gone from the IFU that says you need 1.5 centimeters down to some devices that now can be put in with 1 centimeter. And currently there's an investigational device with Trivascular that'll be to 0.7 centimeters. But clearly, patients who have juxtarenal, pararenal, thoracoabdominal aneurysms up to this point have been excluded. Well, obviously, people have gotten inventive. And Roy Greenberg at the Cleveland Clinic has popularized the concept of a fenestrated graft to treat juxtarenal or pararenal or suprarenal aneurysms. And by fenestration, using very careful measurements in terms of pre-procedure planning, you could decide where you want the side arms to go. And so you put a little cut in the graft. Through that goes a guide wire. Over the guide wire goes a side arm into the appropriate branch. And therefore, you can create a branched graft using a fenestration concept. And this is just a picture showing, looking down the barrel of a graft. Through this cut or fenestration is the side arm. There's a balloon there that would then expand it and seat it within the graft and also stabilize it within the parent vessel. And here is a preoperative CT angiogram looking at the proximity of a pararenal or juxtarenal aneurysm. Obviously a pretty short neck that would not be suitable for most of the endografts at that time. But here we are having solved that problem with grafts into both renal arteries as well as the spiromesenteric artery. And this device, he has been working with Cook in its development. Branched endografts is another platform that has been championed by Tim Tudor at UCSF, also working with Cook. And rather than cutting holes in the graft where you want them and putting side arms, the branched endograft concept is one in which there are little docking ports that are set up for the celiac, spiromesenteric, and the renals, through which you can then access with guide wire, go into the appropriate branch, and then put an endograft and dock it within these pre-positioned side arms. And here is an example of one of Tim's cases showing the branched endograft successfully treating a type 4 thoracoabdominal aortic aneurysm with branches into the celiac, spiromesenteric, and both renal arteries. We're sort of interested in the evolution of how this worked into our own practice. I mentioned that when the only thing we had to begin with was a tube graft, about 10% of our aneurysm population were candidates for that. With the bifurcated graft, we were starting to move toward maybe half. I had the feeling that maybe about 70% of my cases now are done with stent grafts. So one of our research fellows took the opportunity to look at the last 10 years' experience at UCLA to see what's happening in terms of what we're doing, beginning in 1999 and ending up in 2009. And the yellow bars represent open repairs and the red bars represent endo repairs. And as you can see, the yellow bars are dropping, the red bars are rising, and this pretty much represents where we are today. And of course, what's happening is that those that we're doing open are really very challenging cases. They're cases that we can't do with endografts. So in summary, EVAR has really transformed, it's been transformational technology. It's transformed the management of abdominal aortic aneurysm today. And basically, the only open aneurysms repairs that we're doing right now are those with an unfavorable anatomy, juxtarenal, pararenal, suprarenal, etc. But those are going to go away also as fenestrated and branch technologies ultimately come into the mainstream. The thing that worries me, and I think worries a lot of program directors today, is that we're currently training a whole generation of fellows who are going to have very little experience with open aortic surgery. And I don't think open aortic surgery is ever going to disappear completely. And I hope the day when I need an open operation, there's somebody out there that knows how to do it. Thanks very much for your attention.